The average person has very little knowledge of the criminal world. With the idea of informants, double crossings, and murder for profit all seeming like concepts more out of a movie than real life. However, for Scott Lee Kimble, this was the life he had forged for himself, and he was going to see it through until the bitter end. In today's video, we'll be diving into the wild world of an FBI informant trapped in a web of lies that eventually led to him becoming a serial killer. It all began in the quaint town of Boulder, where Scott made his grand entrance into the world in the year 1966. But life wasn't exactly a bed of roses for young Scott. His parents' divorce at an early age shook his world, setting the stage for a tumultuous journey ahead. With his mother coming out as a lesbian and his father remarrying, Scott and his older brother, Brett, found themselves in the care of their grandmother in her cozy mobile home. Little did they know, their idyllic setup would soon turn into a nightmare when Theodore Tahn, their grandmother's neighbor, entered the scene. Theodore's sinister actions, ranging from sexual assault to psychological torment, cast a dark shadow over Scott's formative years. But through it all, Scott remained resilient, determined to carve out a path for himself despite the odds stacked against him. By the turn of the millennium, Scott found himself entangled in a web of crime, his brushes with the law becoming increasingly frequent. From passing bad checks to running scams, he walked a fine line between survival and self-destruction. But despite his best efforts to stay under the radar, Scott's criminal escapades caught up with him, landing him behind bars. It was during his time in prison that Scott's fate took an unexpected turn. A chance encounter with FBI agents presented him with an opportunity to turn his life around, albeit in the most unconventional way possible. Prison, where he convinced FBI agents that he could work with them to help them solve cases as an informant. Arnold Flowers, a man incarcerated alongside Scott, was working to have a federal judge, prosecutor, and witness involved with his case executed. Scott informed the FBI of this and assisted an undercover agent in stopping Arnold. And in exchange, Scott was transferred to a low-security prison. He then discreetly implied to several agents that he had information on other planned hits like Arnold's, and began working with Agent Carl Schlaff to stop fellow inmate Steve Dennis, who Scott alleged was planning on killing witnesses related to a trial about Steve's ecstasy distribution ring. Scott informed Carl that he had promised Steve he would kill Steve's witnesses for him. After being released, the fake plan Scott had concocted to trick Steve into trusting him was for Steve's girlfriend, a woman named Jennifer Markham, to introduce Scott to Steve's crime partner, who would give Scott the gun to kill the witnesses. As he embarked on a journey into the murky world of undercover informants, Scott soon found himself playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse with some of the most notorious criminals in the country. As Scott delved deeper into the underworld, he uncovered a labyrinth of deceit and betrayal, where trust was a commodity in short supply. His interactions with fellow inmates and law enforcement alike blurred the lines between friend and foe, leaving him grappling with the weight of his own morality. Scott was released from prison in late 2002, and it was at this point that he began to prepare for 3 of the 4 murders he would eventually confess to. The first of these murders was that of Jennifer Markham, the girlfriend of fellow inmate and friend of Scott, Steve Ennis. 2 weeks after his release, Scott began meeting up with Jennifer in order to go through with the fake plan of murdering witnesses for Steve. In February of 2003, Jennifer informed her boyfriend that she would be meeting up with Scott for dinner. This would be the last time anyone other than Scott ever heard from Jennifer. Jennifer was presumed missing until 2 months later when Carl asked Scott if he had any information about Jennifer's location, and Scott casually replied that she was dead. However, he wouldn't give any more information than that. Scott was arrested for unrelated charges later that month, and was informed by Carl that the FBI would no longer be using him as an informant. In fact, when Scott had first started working with Carl in the FBI in 2002, he had informed them of a plan to escape from inmate Steve Hawley. What Scott neglected to mention was that he was the one who had concocted the plan with Holly. Scott was also to meet up with Holly's girlfriend, a woman by the name of Leanne Emmy. Leanne eventually started helping Scott with his scams and fraudulent checks, and the two eventually got closer and closer. In late January of 2003, Leanne traveled through different western states with Scott while racking up a total of $155,000 in stolen checks. On January 27th, Leanne called her parents to lie and tell them that she was staying in Mexico. This was the last time they ever heard from her. According to records of her credit card charges, Leanne was in Denver, Colorado at the time, and had a 2-hour-long phone conversation with her cousin, where she said that if Scott knew the two of them were talking, then he would murder both of them. According to Scott's later confession, the two of them drove to Bryson Canyon in Utah, where he then ordered her to take off her clothes and kneel on the rocks before shooting her with a handgun. Also, in January of the same year, Scott met a woman named Lori McLeod at a casino in Denver. The two got to know each other, and Scott informed Lori that he was an FBI agent, before showing her a fake badge and laptop with the FBI seal. Lori easily accepted this ruse and let Scott into her life, where he learned about her 19-year-old daughter, Casey, who was going through a rough time. Although she was on the road to recovery, Casey had a history of fraud, running away, and a previous meth addiction. During August of 2003, Scott learned of Casey's disappearance. He told her the same thing. However, he promised to use his FBI contacts to help get information on her. Casey's trail soon went cold after this, and Lori and Scott eventually got married in Vegas before taking their honeymoon as a camping trip, where they traveled to the Kremling area, very near to where Casey's remains were found years later. During 2004, Scott's uncle Terry came to stay with the newlyweds. Luckily for Lori, she wouldn't have to worry about her unwanted house guest for long. She came back home from work one day only to find that Terry was gone, and the furniture in their home had been rearranged. According to her husband, Terry had won the lottery and had moved to Mexico with the stripper. Having a shred of common sense, Lori suspected Scott was lying, but was relieved to have Terry out of the house, ignorant of the terrible fate that had befallen him. Scott and Lori's marriage soon began to crumble, and eventually, he moved out of the house and rented a place in Lafayette. In early 2006, he got caught in another scam and was eventually tailed by police. Scott led them into the town of Mecca, where he eventually ran out of gas before surrendering to the authorities. After his arrest, Scott was sent back to Montana to serve time for the halfway house he had run from so many years prior. This landed him 2 years in prison, along with an additional 16 months due to some weapon charges. This gave police time to build a murder case against him, which only solidified in April of 2007, when the skull of Casey McLeod was found, confirming her death. Leveraging this information against Scott, he agreed to a plea deal. He would reveal the location of his other victims' bodies, and in exchange, he would be charged with 1 count of murder and be able to avoid a possible death penalty. Scott only ever led investigators to the body of Leanne and Terry, meaning the plea deal was off. Scott still pled guilty to all 4 murders and was sentenced to 70 years, which as of this video, he is still currently serving. Scott has given multiple reasons for his murders, many of which contradict each other.